This is, as we all say, this is a work in progress, and it really is. And I look directly at Leah because we're going to present a real paper that she has to read in a couple of weeks' time. It's probably, the deadline is kicking in. But anyway, and it's interesting because this is initiative, and we thought if we had this constraint, it would help us develop some of our ideas. We're still working on the ideas, but it's an initiative that comes from Janice Fine and Michael Pior, which is really about the total blockage of labor law in the U.S. So what do? You go to other levels. So what's the potential, in a sense, to do things at state or municipal or other levels which represent alternatives than doing it here at the national level? And this, they had a call for papers, and it led us to think, well, what about Canada? What about our federal structure? And federal systems, of course, permit the interplay between centrifugal and, we're going to get this down. There. Federal systems permit the interplay between centrifugal, convergent, and centripetal, divergent forces. The U.S. has been quite centralized in terms of collective labor law, and that's acted as a brake. If you think about it, you know, how do you satisfy Arkansas and Mississippi and Oregon and Washington in the same law? It's an issue. China is an interesting example because we were working with some progressive labor scholars in China, and they said, well, despite the multi-level dominance running right through the system of the party on labor law, that there's scope for local innovation, and they were looking to particular provinces like Guizhou and others where they were able to make some progress and administrative progress in the way that the law is interpreted. Now, Canada has a much stronger variant of decentralization, as you know, well into the DNA of the Canadian Constitution. And in Canadian labor law, there's considerable variation between jurisdictions and over time, but within around the framework of a common model. And we don't want to over-exaggerate the common model here, but we needed to start somewhere. So we started starting in the 1970s, and you can't presume that everything is identical, but we can say there's a kind of common model. So then the question is, to what degree is federalism a case for experimentation? And Paul Weiler actually argues this in his classic work, Reconciliable Differences, which is a wonderful treatment of labor law in its practical application as well. And so we want to look at the variations and how to understand them. And I feel that when I look at the wonderful work being done at York University on the effectiveness of law, we're not talking about the effectiveness of law here. We're talking about innovations and the way that innovations might come about. We thought, let's start out with some theses which might explain the variation observed in Canadian labor law. So one of the ideas is there is an epistemic community around improving and defending the model. And the model emerges pragmatically, jurisprudentially, legislatively over a period of time, and then there's really a community of interest, be they former deputy ministers of labor or active deputy ministers of labor, be they people working in labor ministries and tight, which are somewhat immune to the politicians and who seek to develop this common model. And in fact, there are lots of mechanisms in Canada that make that happen. I spoke just 2 weeks ago to the meeting of the Labor Board chairs, which was here in Montreal, and they meet regularly for this kind of meeting. There's one of Deputy Ministers of Labor as well, that kind of thing. We have a common model. It's set in time, it's improvable, and we have mechanisms to do so. Now, there are two long wave theses about the political economy of labor policy. One is the rise of industrial citizenship. We can call this the young Harry Arthurs. And then the neoliberal turn, and we'll talk about the later Arthurs, but we could talk about anyone in that sense. So one is a view of the political economy gives rise, with economic expansion, to progressive expansion of labor rights. And the other, of course, is that the neoliberal turn undermines these labor rights and pushes towards flexibilization of the kind described by Francisco or Anil in various incarnations. A third thesis is political partisanship. In other words, if you want to understand the variability, just look at which government is elected, and the labor norms are going to shift back and forth in relation to that. So any shift between conservative, centrist, and social democratic parties, and whoops, what just happened in Ontario? Well, the work that you did so much collectively to have a new piece of labor legislation in 2017 is swept aside by Doug Ford, who says, we no longer need this. This is a partisan turn. And a final set of theses is one on enduring differentiation between provinces. Newfoundland is not PEI. Newfoundland and Labrador, BC is not Alberta, Quebec is not Ontario, and one way of describing that is on founding values and civic culture. There was a clean slate meeting at which Isabelle Ferreira, David Dury, and a number of others were at Harvard last week, and Isabelle Ferreira was describing her notions of the enterprise, and she said, well, in Belgium and Germany, we elect workers to the boards of firms, and the American interlocutor said, that's wild. How does it work? So that's a founding values idea. It's so different that it doesn't compute. And the other is more a Jessup idea that there are social forces and class compromises that over time come to some accommodation and are translated into institutional compromises. Now we could add here, Michel, legislation about the Supreme Court decisions and that as a force pushing towards commonality. We're not dealing with that at the moment. So we use 4 exploratory test cases, and we decided to take 2 from individual labor standards and 2 from collective labor law, and in so doing have a mix, but also in this sense say, okay, and why select them? Because they represent innovations over time. Okay, so rather than saying it's just the common model, we're trying to see what happens over a period of time with these innovations. So the unjust dismissal, the method for obtaining union recognition, anti-strike breaking or replacement workers, and psychological harassment. So they're different areas. This is unreadable, but let's just look at unjust dismissal. And interestingly, it starts in 1975 in Nova Scotia. Then it's adopted by Quebec, which reinforces it twice by reducing the qualifying periods. Then it's done by the federal level and then by Quebec. So you've got this movement, Nova Scotia, federal, Quebec, and then no one else. Secondly, card check. I mean, this is a real party. As you can see, these are the columns that are completely full because you have this movement back and forth. The good example being at federal level, it became a mandatory vote for union recognition in 2015, though it hadn't been since PC 1003 in 1944. In 2015, and then in 2017, this was reversed and we were back to the previous system. Ontario, there's some back and forth. Quebec is constant. There's no back and forth at all. BC, there's back and forth. Alberta, back and forth. And interestingly enough, just in 2017, we've gone to the card check system in Alberta. If you have 65% or more, that seems to be crusted in there. If you can get 65% of the people signing union cards, it's much more likely to have a card check certification. Saskatchewan was complete change from 2008. Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, I still have a bit to work out in Newfoundland, Labrador, PEI. We go back up to anti-strike breaking. This is really Quebec, 1977, though there's a more complicated history here. John Logan does a very good job in looking at how professional strikebreakers are outlawed or not. But Quebec came in 1977 with the total replacement It was adopted in Ontario, not exactly the same thing, in 1992 by the Ray government, but reversed in 1995 by the Harris government. And BC, interestingly enough, though it's a partial ban, only on outside, not on inside workers in other words, you can't break the strike in Quebec. You have to remain outside, whereas in BC, workers can return to work even though they're ostensibly on strike. So it's partial, but it has not shifted. And then finally, psychological harassment. It starts in Quebec in 2002. And it's very interesting how it came about. Jean Rochon was Minister of Health. He'd been working in France. France had recently adopted an anti-harassment provision. And he said, this is important, and other people thought it was important. When they talked to people elsewhere in Canada, they thought they were completely nuts. In other words, why are you doing this? But 2018, lo and behold, suddenly, and in Quebec, it was expanded to include specifically sexual harassment in 2018. And in 2018, the Trudeau government and the Ministry of Labor passed the Senate yesterday. So this essentially, we have something new here. So how do we explain it? Now, I'm going to show you a very sophisticated, well, first the variation, unjust dismissal, 3 jurisdictions, stable in all 3. Psychological harassment, 2 jurisdictions, Quebec most recently, but you see it's stable. Union anti-strike-breaking replacement workers, 2 to 3 jurisdictions only, and stable in 2 of them. And union recognition, continuous and repeated movement back and forth between card check and mandatory votes, except in Quebec, which was stable. So now the sophisticated quantitative technique. These represent the strength of the explanation. Let's look at the common model. The epistic community is quite important in the sense that you're thinking, how do labor legislators think about the legislation, and how might they want to develop it over time? The long wave citizenship is important in the run-up, but becomes much less important in the decline. So you can say that the neoliberal turn is important, except the neoliberal turn doesn't explain why there's the movement back and forth between card check and mandatory vote. We would expect that the greater emphasis on individualism is automatically pushing us in the direction of voting, whereas we have all of these counterexamples, and probably there's going to be a counterexample in BC soon. We have a counterexample at federal level. It's not just pushing towards mandatory votes, which you would expect from the neoliberal turn. It's clearly present. The partisan politics are very important and almost completely explain the certification changes that were taking place, except it doesn't explain the constancy of Quebec in not changing this, because it's not moving back and forth. So this requires another explanation. The founding values are kind of there, because when we look at the provinces that are doing this and leading, it's often Quebec. So John Goddard argument is, well, they speak French and I don't understand what they're talking about. But so it's different here. And the social forces argument, I think, is very important, because in explaining why you have anti-strike breaking in 2 jurisdictions, and it sticks over time. And I was talking, I had some email correspondence with people in BC explaining why the Campbell government did not reverse the anti-strike breaking. And they said, well, we had a lot of mobilization. They were afraid of violence. And we promised some violence, and there was a kind of some trade-offs in that sense. So there's real torque in each case where the social forces are very important. So I'm on to my last slide. This is the psychological harassment. Again, very interesting, because it comes out of as I said, a common model argument, and a long wave argument, because really in the minds of the legislators, they were trying to develop something. They said, we have all this development on the collective side, but we have not counteracted, and we need a common model which is much more comprehensive. But perchance that just happened in Quebec until Me Too, and Me Too is a social force or social movement argument which is coming through in 2018 and really pushing it. So last slide. Federalism seems to be a source of institutional experimentation. There are significant variations, continuous movement with innovators and experimenters. There's a clear differences between the collective, more to and fro, and individual, which is incremental, and there's been less, except Ontario 2018, this something new, where people actually ratchet back on minimum standards. So that's interesting. So there is an incremental notion. The assessment of the different explanations, I think I just gave them. They're complementary. There's nothing too sophisticated about this, but there is a common model notion where people invested in the system try and improve it and develop it. And that's on labor boards, it's in ministries of labor, it's elsewhere, which doesn't mean that finance departments believe in this at all, but there isn't a community around this that's the point you defend. Neoliberalism plays an increasingly significant role. Collective labor relations are much more strongly affected by neoliberalism and partisan politics, but social forces play a key role in explaining the emergence and the sustainability of experimentation, so that we look at why things stick in Quebec. We go into more detail in the explanation. Why anti-strikebreaking sticks in BC. These are arguments that I think need to be developed, and they're important because they help us think about experimentation and how social forces combine with experimentation to develop new policies and make them stick.